At the dawn of the new decade, everything was going to be different for Dungeons and Dragons. The great war between Gygax and Arneson was far from over, but it was now overshadowed by a battle fought on the national stage, where the game would be subject to challengers that were louder and less rational than disputes about credit and royalties. From this point forward, the American media played as large a role in defining D&D as did the game's creators. A People magazine story about Gary Gygax from the second week of January relayed that ever since D&D was dreamed up, stores have been waging a losing crusade to keep it in stock. The article shipped with a full-page close up of Gygax's looming face mugging gamely over a handful of fantasy miniatures, bearded, bespectacled, benevolent, but a bit manic as he twists his gaze down at these emblems of his unlikely success. Another picture attached to the same article showed Gygax and his wife under the covers in bed, a sort of John and Yoko moment. Though in this case Gygax is reading from Andrew Lang's Green Fairy book while Mary lovingly looks on. The People article identified Gygax as D&D's 41-year-old inventor, and it was rare for any notices to hint that someone other than Gygax had contributed to the creation of D&D. Even where a caveat identifies Gygax as the co-author of the rules, his counterpart routinely went unnamed. No doubt, with each article that neglected Arneson, the urgency of legal redress increased. At the Hobby Industry of America's annual January show, everything had changed. What had begun the previous year as the Hobby, Gaming, and Military Miniature Division within the HIA had now taken on the simpler and more compelling name, Adventure Gaming. While it encompassed all manner of war games and role-playing games, its flagship title, its exemplar, was necessarily D&D. Howard Barash, who was in attendance, reported that without a doubt, Dungeons and Dragons was the most talked about product at the show. Barash observed of D&D that its success is helping draw attention to our entire hobby. And to one man in particular, Gary Gygax is emerging as a top celebrity with his name, face, and product making it on national TV, People, Us, and Parade magazines, plus a host of local shows and numerous articles. Barash suspected that TSR had already surpassed SPI in total sales, and that way D&D and its support items are selling, TSR will probably become the largest company in the hobby. By the time Barash would next tabulate industry sales, he would turn out to be right. A report at the start of the year in Space Gamer predicted that TSR Hobbies will emerge as the largest gaming firm if it can survive two hurdles. One was the risk associated with moving to mass market outlets such as Kmart, which could alienate the hobby market while triggering a spectacular but short-lived popular fad. The other hurdle was a lawsuit by D&D co-copyright holder Dave Arneson. Loss of that case could have a major impact on the way TSR does business. While his lawsuit slowly progressed, Arneson had the unenviable task of trying to gain a foothold in this market for his adventures in fantasy. Excalibur took out a full-page advertisement for it in the February issue of Different Worlds, which promised mail-order copies of the autograph box first edition at the special price of $15. This offer was valid only while supplies last, and retailers were invited to schedule pre-orders to inform the size of an anticipated second printing. Having learned from his experiences at Heritage to do his own marketing, Arneson scheduled a promotional event at a small West Coast convention and sent out a mass mailing to people who had bought the playtest copy from him the year before, offering them a $6 discount on the new Excalibur edition. The same flyer warned that the price would rise to $20 per copy after April 1st. By the summer, when the first reviews of Adventures in Fantasy started to appear, the price had climbed to $25. Early reviews showed just how hard the path ahead was for Arneson. Space Gamer suggested, had he and co-designer Richard Snyder convinced Excalibur Games Incorporated to publish this game before 1979, it might have been a rival for D&D. Today, it's too little for too much money. Reaction among fans was less generous. In alarums and excursions, the game was called hopelessly unplayable and a real turkey. SPI's Ares magazine deemed, the price is high, the graphics are terrible, and the rules are worse, and many of the systems are overly complicated. While an executive at Excalibur sent an angry rejoinder to Space Gamer calling its treatment a hatchet job, in the 1980 survey of that magazine's readership, Adventures in Fantasy ranked second to last overall among role-playing games. Unfortunately, this was indicative of the coverage that the game received in the industry. The Chaosium did invite Arneson to contribute an Adventures in Fantasy section to a role-playing product based on the popular Thieves' World, shared world fantasy anthology, but it would only amount to a handful of pages. Otherwise, the game simply made little headway. At the time, Arneson still intended to publish elements of his Blackmoor setting as an unofficial D&D supplement through the Chaosium. For years they had anticipated the Island of Wolf and the City of the Gods, scenarios Arneson had originally promised to Judges Guild, but Different Worlds reported in June that Arneson is plugging away on two different Blackmoor campaign supplements, Egg of Coot and Land of the Scandaharians. Arneson still hoped to deploy smaller firms as foot soldiers in his great war against TSR, but in that respect, he was hopelessly overmatched. TSR, through its license agreements, wielded disproportionate influence over much of the industry. The conceit there was a stark distinction between the original D&D game and the new advanced game was built into the very structure of their licenses. Although Minifigs held a license for the original game, TSR separately built out a license for the advanced game in the spring of 1980, awarding it to Grenadier. In addition to their license for the original D&D game, the Judges Guild had to sign a separate 5% licensing agreement the year before for the advanced game, paying TSR first quarter royalties for 1980 of $37,045, then $46,018 in the second. That deal would expire in another year and they could ill afford any increase in that percentage fee, but nor was it clear that they could survive without an agreement with TSR. Some firms had sufficient standing to remain viable without TSR's beneficence. When TSR announced in the pages of Games Workshop's magazine, White Dwarf, that it had formed a UK subsidiary that would begin operating on March 30th, the exclusive distribution agreement between TSR and Games Workshop had already come to a close. But if they were not to be allies, they would be competitors. The 20th issue of White Dwarf featured an advertisement proclaiming in huge letters, in typefaces reminiscent of a certain film that released that summer, that the British Empire strikes back. There could be no doubt whom Games Workshop intended to strike back against. After more than a decade of invasion by alien games, the Empire is at last prepared for the counterattack. They explained, "We have watched, waited, and studied." Now they launched an initial slate of 4-box games, including a license of the popular Doctor Who television series, and had ambitions to enter the fantasy miniature gaming space shortly. But at that point, would TSR rather ally with a hobby firm like Games Workshop or the toy and electronic giants Mattel? Licensing with Mattel meant the development of a handheld electronic D&D game. As Gygax explained, the game will have a labyrinth-type display through which the player will maneuver his character. The Mattel agreement would encompass a number of future electronic games projects, and it was signed with an immediate advance of $25,000 and a 6.5% future royalty on net sales. A separate agreement also gave Mattel permission to develop D&D software cartridges for its video game console and television under the same terms. TSR could afford to play hardball with licensing as its game sales soared under its supercharged distribution agreement with Random House. When Random House received shipments from TSR, they paid an immediate advance of around a quarter of the expected retail sales. So on March 6th, after a flurry of February purchase orders, TSR received a payment from them of $79,000, and then on March 12th, another $140,000. The checks coming through this deal were simply staggering for the hobby industry of the time. Theirs was the sort of relationship where Will Niebling and Lawrence Schick would fly to Nassau in the Bahamas in the first week of May to brief TSR's distributor on forthcoming releases. Random House wanted to hear not just from a sales guy like Niebling, but also from Schick, the head of design, who could speak to creative direction. As a result of that meeting, Random House promised to distribute 25,000 copies of the 1981 Dragon calendar and eagerly awaited the forthcoming World of Greyhawk campaign setting. And then there were possibilities that could outshine even book sales. In June, the Los Angeles Times reported that a film based on D&D was in the works at 20th Century Fox, gossiping about talks that had been in progress since last February. A deal memo circulating in 1980 would grant Fox a 2-year option from TSR for a film based on D&D for a down payment of $100,000 toward a purchase price of $250,000, though that number would go up if 1980 D&D sales were to exceed the 1979 figures. Gygax would develop a treatment for the project and receive an executive producer credit, as would Brian Bloom. And they would have approval of the screenplay. screenplay, and key creative personnel. In compensation for their services, the producers would themselves split a six-figure sum and generous cut of the net profits. Allowances would be made for potential sequels and even a television series based on D&D. Gygax in particular became captivated by this project, but deals that large take time to work out, and negotiations dragged on throughout the year. With Gygax dazzled by the spotlight of the national stage, work on fresh D&D product increasingly fell to TSR's small design department, under Lawrence Schick as vice president. Work was driven largely by Tom Moldvay, Gene Wells, and Zeb Cook. Drafting the new expert set, which was due May 1st. Originally, the plan had been to perform only minor revisions to the basic set, but once work started on Expert, they soon appreciated the large changes needed in the design, and the need for it to lock with the Expert set also being written. The new plan was that Basic will be designed for characters of low level, with powerful monsters and references to higher levels kept to a minimum, except where they can be explained adequately. More emphasis will be placed on how to play the game. As a crush of new players entered the D&D market, introductory explanations were more necessary than ever. The efforts of the design team were spread thin, however. Cook and Schick were developing a new science fiction role-playing game for TSR, something that could compete more directly with Traveller. The project, now called Alien Worlds, was a subject of playtesting throughout the year. But the design department had a scope of responsibilities they simply did not have enough staff to discharge. Apparently, a note at the end of the March report read, "Higher executives are unaware of how soon we need a new design person. To this end, we will be preparing a case showing how much time we lose just answering letters. It has started to become quite serious." It did not help that Gene Wells was sidelined around this time due to an incident involving the module Palace of the Silver Princess, which was notoriously pulped due to objectionable content. Apart from some sexually charged imagery, it also contained an Errol Otis drawing with numerous company in-jokes and perhaps caricatures of certain TSR executives. As of the April 15th design team meeting, Wells was using her design skills to tackle our increasing letter load and doing typing and other work besides, under Cook's supervision. As TSR staffed up, importing entire families to the sleepy town of Lake Geneva, it formed something of an isolated enclave where employees largely socialized among themselves. New hires might crash on another staffer's couch for a month or two, or even live out of the gray house at 723 Williams for a stint. If you brought family in tow, they too might find employment at TSR. When the design staff relocated Kevin Hendricks from Texas along with his wife Mary, she would soon work the retail counter in the Dungeon Hobby Shop. And this was not simple nepotism. They needed all the help they could get. During the revision of the basic set, the design staff fretted, "There are problems having to wait for Gary's decisions on seemingly fine points. Perhaps a clearer directive from higher up on the design concepts and how much leeway we have would help." It is hardly surprising that Gygax's time was hard to come by, given his national media prominence at that moment. TSR just could not manage to stay out of the spotlight. Echoes of the Egbert affair continued to ripple through the national media when TSR released Merle Rasmussen's new espionage role-playing game, Top Secret. Early in 1980, they fell into another small publicity windfall. Apparently, some notes from Mike Carr's playtesting campaign had been left at a local Lake Geneva establishment, and because they ostensibly detailed a plot to assassinate an Israeli businessman named William Weatherby, they ended up in the hands of law enforcement. A telltale logo on one of the pages led the FBI to the Hotel Claire, where they asked some polite questions before they were satisfied that the conspiracy was entirely fictitious. Carr quickly saw in this a marketing opportunity, and the press outreach for Top Secret incorporated the story of how the game was so realistic it had fooled the FBI. But a new and less welcome front in TSR's battle to control its public image opened with news from Wasatch Middle School in Heber City, Utah, where an after-school D&D program founded at the beginning of the year had attracted around 28 high-performing students. At a March 27th meeting of the Heber School Board, an attorney named Donald George, spokesperson for a group of concerned parents, presented a detailed case for terminating the program. Some of his objection derived from the potential for sacrilege in the game, from the use of holy water to the practice of spells like water walk, but he mostly seemed to see it as a waste of time and resources. The Heber board ultimately voted against banning the game, and overwhelmingly parents approved their children to participate. When consulted, it turned out the group of concerned parents was just two couples. Dissidents, however, raised the matter again. At an April 10th school board meeting, school officials urged them to just let the program run its course, as students left to their own devices would turn to other interests soon enough. Inevitably, the more D&D was perceived as a forbidden activity, the more kids would clamor to play it. Sales at a local game store reportedly doubled, and many students said they would now go on playing after the conclusion of the program. By the time the disgruntled parents tried to involve the state school board in the controversy, the exasperated superintendent announced that the program would be discontinued. He clarified that no scheduled activities had been canceled. We finished out the cycle. We did it on our own volition without any outside pressure. But the syndicated news stories spread in wake of this decision provided a more sensational and reductive account of the events in Heber City, that school officials had banned the game. Moreover, reports on the Heber City controversy represented that D&D had been banned on religious grounds. One non-denominational Christian minister felt that the school board decision only scratched the surface of the real problem, that D&D is very definitely anti-religious, and indeed that it comes from that old subversive source Satan. The new decade would bring with it a widespread satanic panic in American culture, one that painted various youth trends, including heavy metal music, as causes of anti-Christian behavior. Effectively, these critics argued the inverse of the previous narrative about Egbert. Instead of claiming that his imaginary game could induce players to believe its fantasy was real, they believed that players mistakenly thought the fantasy of the game was imaginary when it actually indoctrinated them into real-world witchcraft and demonology. In the eyes of these critics, Gygax and Arneson truly were wizards, who simply disguised their black magic as a game. The irony was that both of them strongly self-identified as Christians. Arneson even started working in the autumn with the Way International on a game for memorizing Bible verses. The spotlight followed controversy, and the debt that TSR owed to alarmist press was beyond evaluation. An article published in New West in August 1980 quoted a model retailer columnist's advice to TSR. They should raise a foundation to this Egbert kid. Except for the disappearance of that boy and the resulting national exposure, TSR could have remained a steadily growing hobby game company instead of a skyrocketing one. Gygax, interviewed for the same piece, had to admit it was immeasurably helpful to us in name recognition. Those words were surely recorded before another sadder echo of the previous year's publicity, as newspapers around the country reported the suicide of James Dallas Egbert on August 16th. This led to a new spate of articles with sensational titles like Youth Buried with His Secret, while William Dear despicably exploited the occasion to tease the press that he still held secrets about the past year's investigation that might or might not link Egbert's face to D&D. I've waited very heavily, Dear told reporters, but he could see no use in revealing what he knew, and so the press syndicates would affirm that the mystery of his whereabouts for the month has never been cleared up. But the New York Times discovered that after the young man's death, his anguished parents needed the truth to be told at last. Egbert's parents had withheld the details at the urging of a flamboyant private detective who wanted them to sell movie rights to the story. The heart-wrenching truth was that Egbert had, in the summer of 1979, fled from as far from his school as he could to New Orleans before drinking a mixture of root beer and cyanide in a hotel room. He survived this suicide attempt. He worked at an oil field in Louisiana until he was persuaded to call his mother. Only then, when his mother connected him to Dear, had Egbert discovered the intense media attention around his disappearance. While Egbert was still missing, Dear first approached the parents about the possibility of capitalizing on this remarkable story. He insisted that out the sensational publicity he recklessly courted was, as the Times put it, one of the best hopes of turning up witnesses and clues. When Egbert surfaced, Dear impressed upon him the potential value of the rights to the story, money that might be badly needed, especially as the showy and profligate search from Egbert had run up a tab reportedly nearing $40,000. For a time, Egbert and Dear were partners in this endeavor. Egbert's parents went along with the plan, even giving Dear power of attorney for the purposes of negotiation with Hollywood, but that permission was retracted with Egbert's passing, and instead, in the hopes of doing some good, his parents went public with the whole story. In time, it would become clear that they did not manage to close all the avenues Dear might explore to profit from the story himself, however, and the popular imagination continued to contextualize Egbert's situation in a pattern of juvenile harm inflicted by D&D. TSR could not afford to tolerate a recurring narrative in the press that D&D was harmful to children. An advertisement in the August Dragon solicited for real-life clerics who would attest to the game's helpful, positive influence on those who play it. And one obliging reverend shared his endorsement in the issue following. TSR countered these reports by forming an education department with a mandate to leverage the TSR product line, including D&D in classrooms. Spreading into the educational market was not merely an attempt to shed a pall of unwholesomeness, but was also an attempt at diversification, finding new markets, even if it was then unthinkable that the public's appetite for D&D was anywhere near saturation. Branching out into areas like education is only one way that staffing swelled at TSR. By spring, the number of employees had grown to 76, double the year before. Gygax's confidant Steve Marsh came on board temporarily to assist Zeb Cook with the expert set. The team report from May 15th explained that Zeb had started on the section for players and Steve Marsh has taken over the monsters section. Jim Ward, who had freelanced for TSR as early as 1975, finally quit his job as a schoolteacher and joined TSR on June 16th. But just as they were putting the finishing touches on his forthcoming Deities and Demigods book, interesting, Ward would join the sales department rather than his design. So his addition did little to alleviate the mad rush there, which in addition to rewriting the basic set and pruning the sprawling expert set rules, included preparing a large tournament for GenCon. Although the Alien Words project remained a priority, the design department report from June states bluntly that no serious work had been done on it in the last 3 months. As of May, the company became large enough to need an internal newsletter, one called Random Events, which introduced new hires, advertised employee events and corporate initiatives, and furnished a healthy dose of TSR's corporate culture. At first, one decidedly from the perspective of staff, not management. One aspect of corporate culture that changed at the same time was the departure of Tim Kask from the helm of Dragon. A curt announcement in the May Dragon issue heralded the elevation of Kask's protege, Jake Jacquet, to the editorship of the magazine. Heading a team where he worked closely with Kim Mohan, Jacquet had great ambitions for TSR periodicals, which they would rebrand Dragon Publishing in May. He circulated an internal proposal to form an association for D&D and AD&D players focused on participating in a nationwide multiple tournament contest for a national title. Naturally, the platform of Dragon Publishing might keep the proposed association's membership abreast of events. There was simply no question of cramming the expanding staff into the Hotel Clare and 723 William Street, so TSR leased a large facility a mile or two north at 281 Sheridan Springs Road. Sheridan Springs, incidentally, was named for the Civil War General Philip Sheridan, who visited the area in 1874 and praised the quality of the natural spring near that road. A century later, those waters bubbled into a Coca-Cola bottling plant. As the new TSR facility there had formerly been occupied by Leisure and Recreational Products, a company that customized vans, employees called it the LRP building. The previous occupants left behind enough material that the walls of TSR's front office were remodeled with automobile upholstering. The sales area, for example, was done in a light brown vinyl with ornamental buttons. For the time being, the creative staff, including both artists and game designers, remained at the Hotel Clare. Commuting between the two, and especially parking at the LRP building, became a notorious bureaucratic hassle. It was only a taste of the growing pains expansion would bring. There is no small irony that Origins found itself in need of a last-minute venue in 1980. The planned convention space, the University of Delaware, rescinded its permission, a move widely attributed to fears that some Egbert-like incident might befall the campus. So the convention instead returned to Widener College in Chester, Pennsylvania, to the same lack of air conditioning despite a promise to the contrary in the program, and with the exhibit hall cramming 100 vendor booths into an even smaller space. By comparison, Random Events would snark, the Black Hole of Calcutta was a vast wasteland. Attendance was steady, with vague tallies indicating 3 or 4,000 in all, but many reports spoke wistfully of the pinnacle Origins had reached in 1978 at Ann Arbor. The irony of worrying over Origins attendees venturing into the steam tunnels, of course, was that Origins was supposed to be a bastion of level headed wargaming, though that too was changing. And Saturday night, SPI head Jim Dunnigan made what one observer called an impassioned plea to the historical gamers not to become overly paranoid about the growth of the science fiction fantasy theme. No doubt because SPI was debuting its first fantasy role playing game, Dragon Quest. The growing competition in the role playing space was on full display at Origins. Someone asked Dave Arneson, whose booth offered autographed copies of Adventures in Fantasy for $25 to justify the steep price, only to be informed as an attendee put it that autographed copies would be collector's items in 3 to 4 years. Meanwhile, across the hall, Dragon Quest traded briskly as a box set, like Adventures in Fantasy, containing 150 pages worth of rulebooks for just $9.95. Even the box version of RuneQuest would come in at $19.95, and it contained the core rulebook, which then traded for $11.95 alone. In addition to 6 dice, a module, a book of monsters, and a tutorial on basic role-playing, pricing certainly kept Adventures in Fantasy in the margins. Perhaps the most striking debut at Origins was the presence of Microcomputer Games, a new subsidiary of Avalon Hill selling commercial wargame software. Where TSR had been happy to field out a license to Mattel to adapt D&D for computers in exchange for royalties, Avalon Hill invested in a substantial move into the computer space. They were not the only wargame publisher branching out in this space. Dave Wesley's Discovery Games, no doubt funded by the Avalon Hill release of Source of the Nile the year before, spent 1980 developing a Squadron Leader series of World War II aerial combat computer games, all running on the same engine. Under the rubric of 4D Interactive Systems, a company founded by 4 Twin Cities Coalition veterans whose name began with D. Arneson worked on these Discovery titles as well. Ultimately, Avalon Hill's Microcomputer Games division would end up distributing some of the titles that Discovery Games produced. At the conclusion of Origins, the Game Manufacturers Association took formal charge of the convention, cementing the convention's position as the alternative to TSR and GenCon. The consortium of 5 key manufacturers at the helm of Gamma heard bids for 1981 and, having long intended to hold a West Coast Origins, awarded the convention to the organizers of Pacificon, who had run the former GenCon West convention in the Bay Area. Immediately thereafter, they scheduled the 1982 Origins for Baltimore, a return to its original venue. TSR made a token showing at Origins, with a small delegation to manage tournaments for Top Secret, Gamma World, and Dungeon. And the D&D properties largely overseen by Will Niebling in Gygax's absence. Gygax and Bloom were in Los Angeles in July with Mattel exploring further directions for electronic D&D games, and no doubt with other parties continuing to discuss Hollywood opportunities. The Origins D&D tournament, a Zeb Cook design called Dwellers of the Forbidden City, was organized around just 3 sessions with 4 groups of 6 adventurers each. People would play in total less even than competed in the first Origins tournament in 1975, While TSR would not neglect Origins entirely, they had every reason to view it as an inhospitable venue and redouble their own focus on Gencon. Gencon in 1980 would be the first place most people would see the world of Greyhawk. Its absence at Origins, where it had long been promised, was lamented by many attendees there. This would be the first campaign world setting that TSR brought to the market. Though many of their prior modules were nominally situated in it, in the context of the ongoing legal dispute, the release of the World of Greyhawk showed the general populace of D&D fans for the first time a map, albeit heavily revised and expanded one of the Great Kingdom of the Castle and Crusade Society, and by implication how Blackmoor and Greyhawk were rooted in it. Blackmoor itself warrants only a brief paragraph deeming it a little-known territory, with an anonymous ruler and a ruined castle under which the extensive labyrinths are supposed to exist. But the main release for Gencon would be a D&D review debut. The hardcover advanced book, Deities and Demigods. This expansion and update to the 1976 supplement, Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, added a number of real-world pantheons, including entries for Babylonian and Native American religions, but also a warm salute to the fantasy fiction that inspired D&D. TSR had licensed the setting of Johann von Fritz Leiber for its Lenkmar game back in 1976, so that was a natural addition. Eric Holmes had generously supplied a version of Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos to Dragon late in 1977, and those elements would be wrapped into deities and demigods along with a section based on Michael Moorcock's Elric series. By 1980, however, the Chaosium had secured a license to publish games based on Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos from Arkham House, and before publishing their 1977 board game Elric, they secured all game rights to the stories of Elric of Mellenborn, as their press release proudly announced back then, so a hasty second print of Deities and Demigods would feature an acknowledgments reading. Special thanks are also given to Chaosium Incorporated for permission to use the material found in the Cthulhu mythos and the Mellenbornian mythos. But this intellectual property issue should not overshadow the reality that a company trying to overcome perceived Christian sacrilege might have thought twice before releasing a book about deities that characters could worship, especially one that includes quite a few adaptations of real-world faiths outside the Judeo-Christian tradition. After years of trailing Origins in attendance, Gencon finally caught up. Dragonwood put the final attendance figures at 4,300 for Origins and 4,500 for Gencon, but internal TSR documents suggest it was a tie, with Gencon also coming in at 4,300. No doubt the spike in attendance was driven partially by the massive Advanced D&D Open Tournament, which encompassed more than 800 players in parties of 9 overseen by more than 40 dungeon masters, with 7 rounds of play spanning all 4 days of the convention. The adventure, which pitted players against the slavers of the Pomarge, familiar to purchasers of the World of Greyhawk, would soon be published in a series of 4 modules, beginning with the slave pits of the Undercity. Now GenCon attracted the sort of coverage mainstream industry trade magazines would usually reserve for the hobby industry of America conventions. Playthings gave GenCon 6 pages that summer, and it neatly explained how it measured up to its long-standing rival. The two shows are highly competitive, but Origins emphasizes board war games, and GenCon has become the world's capital for fantasy role-playing. Companies like Heritage knew how to bring those offerings to GenCon. Duke Seafried was on hand to demonstrate their new role-playing game Knights and Magic, which tried to return adventure gaming to its roots in miniatures. Playthings observed that one could readily perceive an industry schism on display at GenCon between these companies who clung to the legacy of wargaming and those who embraced the new adventure gaming path blazed by D&D. Eric Dott, the president of Avalon Hill, indignantly told the magazine that people can call it what they want, but when you're in a military conflict situation, it's still a war game. Interest in D&D was hardly confined to industry reporters. Around Gen Con, Tom Halving of the television show 2020 would visit Lake Geneva and tour the Hotel Claire offices with Gygax, surrounded by a full camera crew. A few pictures from that day appeared in random events, though the footage would not air until the following year. And then a reporter from Forbes came to visit the new TSR office after GenCon, where he found Brian Bloom in a three-piece suit and Gygax wearing a t-shirt. Is Dungeons & Dragons the hula hoop of the 80s? The reporter asked. Forbes noted one factoid about the median age range of D&D purchasers, which over the past 2 years had dropped decidedly from ages 18 through 22 down to ages 10 to 14. Demographic figures released by TSR show that 46% of D&D sets in 1980 were purchased by or for children between the ages of 10 and 14, with another 26% for those between 15 and 17. There is a variety of data to similar effect available. Over half the subscribers to Dragon in 1980 were under 18. For example, and the median age of subscribers had already dropped to 16. While the youth market was attractive to anyone in the toy and hobby business, it was a market that came with certain constraints and limitations that might be hard for TSR to navigate, especially as the Satanic Panic grew. Now close to the 10-year anniversary of the date when Gygax lost his job at the Fireman's Fund Insurance Company, a sort of corporate origin myth, maybe a character that Gygax played, started to solidify about how his termination had inspired a bout of self-reflection and ultimately a new career goal of inventing games. While it was true that Gygax used that temporary forced vacation from employment to work on amateur games for semi-commercial publication, no one in their right mind back then would have aspired to make a livelihood designing the sorts of rules Gygax then favored. Nonetheless, the November issue of Playthings had it that Gygax quit his job as an insurance underwriter to write for various gaming publications, and Forbes delivered a similar line. The spotlight had begun to shape how Gygax saw his own character. Gygax and Bloom hinted to Forbes about greater ambitions. They were considering some bank financing to fund their plans, which would be unusual, as up to now we've been basically pay as you go. To date, TSR had only taken on debt to purchase its Burroughs computer. Even the mortgages of the 2 buildings in Lake Geneva had been done through the separate partnership controlled by Gygax and Bloom. It's a decisive moment at TSR, the Forbes article concluded. Dark corridors stretch off in the distance in several directions. Brian Bloom looks over at Gary Gygax almost as if he was rolling dice in his hand. Nobody's ever had anything this hot, he says, peering in vain. down those dark corridors. It was not easy to decide which businesses TSR needed to be in. Sometimes emergencies demanded action, like when the supply chain problems resulting from the runaway success of the basic set forced TSR to ship boxes with a sheet of cardboard randomizer chits instead of dice. As they had mass importing those dice from Hong Kong, the most economical path forward was for TSR to begin manufacturing its own dice. In time for GenCon, Kevin Bloom had arranged for in-house Dragon dice that would be sold separately and packaged into featured game products. Not that they could do so on the cheap. TSR had molds made at a cost of around $100,000 each and contracted out to a firm in Beloit to forge an initial run of 500,000 dice in 18 colors. Famously, although these dice were stamped with numbers on their faces, the numbers were difficult to read unless colored in with a crayon that would ship with them. In his role of the controller, and as Random Events put it, chief overseer, Kevin Bloom had become indispensable to the company. Around September, a reorganization positioned Kevin Bloom as TSR's treasurer, and explicitly as third in command to his brother Brian and Gary Gygax. At the time, Mike Carr was the company's general manager and remained in charge of the people who create, produce, and market TSR products, meaning all of the sales, marketing, design, development, art, and production. Will Niebling thus reported to Carr at the time, as did Lawrence Schick, but now Carr worked under Kevin. Following this reorganization, the extent to which the Bloom family had staffed certain areas of the company with relatives started to become conspicuous. Doug Bloom, brother to Kevin and Brian, was elevated to vice president of personnel and training. And after Kevin became treasurer, Judy Witt, his wife's sister, took his former position. Among her direct reports was her own husband, Steve Witt, who was in charge of operations. Random Events would sometimes poke fun at the Bloom's family growing ranks, as when it detailed how Brian's wife Vicky, who used to work for Doug, her husband's brother, had moved in the organization. Now she works for Steve, her husband's other brother's wife's sister's husband, which is to say, Kevin's wife's Mary's sister Judy's husband Steve. And then, in the autumn, Judy Witt's brother Jack Sloan came on board in product engineering, which covered purchasing from vendors, and before the end of the year, he would be joined in that capacity by his, Mary, and Judy's father, Bob Sloan. The collective purview of the Bloom family effectively gave them a lock on most questions on how TSR spent money. If Gygax were concerned about Bloom family nepotism, he was not in much of a position to complain. He placed his own son Ernie in charge of the Dungeon Hobby Shop, a position where he was being groomed to take over all consumer-facing aspects of the business. His wife Mary continued to run the Joe Powell Agency, placing advertisements for the increasingly successful Dragon magazine, which gave her personally around a 10% commission on buys that were now hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Gygax's daughter Elise was on payroll, acting as his personal assistant. Even Heidi Gygax would be starting her junior high year in high school in the fall, took a summer job at TSR. He also continued to rely on old friends. Dave Dimery, who had been best man at Gygax's wedding, has his own vice presidency in store. Dimery was an old advertising hand in Chicago, who quickly put together a campaign structured around Morley the Wizard as TSR's new mascot. The success of D&D was something Gygax understandably wanted to share with those closest to him. By that autumn, The full impact of D&D sales on Gygax's personal finances became apparent. A tabulation of royalties paid to him for the 9 months leading up to the end of September 1980 totaled $291,000 and 662. Royalties for the basic set alone contribute nearly $100,000 to that, and the 3 hardcover advance books piled on a further $140,000 or so, and September would show that sales had further room to grow. It was TSR's best sales month ever, bringing in revenue of $1.8 million, an amount approaching TSR's revenue for the entire 1979 fiscal year. TSR had come a long way since its humble beginnings. In honor of the 5th anniversary of TSR Hobbies, counting from the dissolution of the original partnership, TSR held a Founders Day event early in October, featuring a cake depicting Gygax and Bloom's faces. A picture on the back of Random Events shows Gygax pretending to cut the cake with an axe. But something about Gary Gygax started to change at the end of summer 1980. Surely these enormous royalty payments had life-altering implications, but whether they were the sole cause of the shift is difficult to say. Gygax complained in a letter to Steve Marsh that back on the final day of Gen Con, I was stricken with a strange illness which kept me in bed for about 3 weeks. Although he was briefly hospitalized and subjected to all manners of tests, no diagnoses could be made. In Gygax's subsequent correspondence throughout the year, he complained of lacking energy, being unable to work at 100%. Toward the end of October, he wrote to Marsh that he was happy to postpone full recovery for as long as possible, in part so he could enjoy a few war games at the Dungeon Hobby Shop. Troubling, he reported, I do not have any particular creative urge at this time. It is unclear, though, how much occasion he would have to satisfy that urge, as there is enough administrative work here at TSR to keep me pretty busy from day to day. Surely managing the growing prosperity of TSR during Gygax of any energy he might have then dedicated to game design. And then not long after he wrote those words to Marsh, Gygax lost his mother to a heart attack while she was visiting Dragonlance Ranch. Gygax had been just 17 years old when his father died. I expected my mother to live on for many years. Well, what can one say? In this state, unwell, famous, bereaved, wealthy, and stymied creatively, Gygax came to the November TSR shareholder meeting, which fell on the day voters would go to the polls to elect Ronald Reagan as the next U.S. president. TSR's business at this point was simply gangbusters. Ed Sawyers, who would start November 5, was the 100th employee. Revenue had effectively quadrupled over the previous year, with the company bringing in around $8.3 million. Accordingly, at the shareholder meeting, they set a new book value for TSR stock at $1,000. The Bloom family stake in TSR was now worth around $1 million. As a measure to protect that substantial holding, a shareholder vote that night brought about a change long in the works. After holding the titles of controller and treasurer, Kevin joined Brian and Gygax on TSR's board of directors. But of course, there was one outstanding worry that TSR's new constituted board had to resolve. Who was the fat guy with the bald lawyer nobody would sit next to? Random Events wondered pettily in its report on the shareholder meeting, the last where Dave Arneson would appear in person. The scorn he faced in that room was not lost on Arneson either, as he wrote in a letter to Chaosium founder Greg Stafford at the time. Ever sat for an hour with 38 people glowering at you? Arneson knew well that the strong sales reported at the shareholder meeting meant more royalties for him, enough that he could take over his own distribution and publishing. By this point, Excalibur had lost its appetite for publishing adventures and fantasy. Sitting on a large amount of inventory that simply would not move, on November 12th, they signed over all rights to Arneson's company, Adventure Games. It was around this time that Arneson stopped using the name Adventures Unlimited, so the contract marking this transfer of rights has the old company crossed out and the new one penciled in. The transaction would be covered by the Hobby Press. Strategy and Tactics ran a brief blurb to the effect that Dave Arneson has been disappointed with the low sales and the high price of his game, Adventures in Fantasy, produced by Excalibur Games. To remedy this, he has bought back the game and will publish it under his own company name, Adventure Games, for $20. Arneson planned to open a new office in St. Paul on November 15th, and had already convinced Dave McGarry to come back home from Boston to work there. He also negotiated toward a new contract with Richard Snyder for the rights to a still unpublished Mutant. Arneson's willingness to spend cash probably reflected the optimism of his legal team about their prospects in his dispute with TSR. The fundamental uncopyrightability of game rules was one of the larger difficulties that Arneson's legal team needed to overcome if they followed his narrative, that their client's main contribution to the joint work was some unessential, uncopyrightable original idea. Much of the resulting argument is quite technical and dependent on the authoritative treatise Nimmer on Copyright, the standard guide to copyright law. A passage in Nimmer highlighted by Arneson's legal team does suggest that uncopyrightable ideas can qualify as a contribution to a joint work if authors A and B work in collaboration, but A's contribution is limited to plot ideas which standing alone would not be copyrightable, and B weaves the idea into a completed literary expression. It would seem that A and B are joint authors of the resulting work. But to be counted as work in collaboration, the authors would have to intend to collaborate on it. It was not enough if Arneson had previously and independently invented original ideas like dungeon adventuring and experience points, and those ideas were only later observed by Gygax and woven into a completed work. No one disputed that Arneson had sent rules text to Gygax, who freely volunteered he had received 18 or 20 such pages, but those basic ideas dated before Arneson had any intention of collaborating with Gygax on D&D. Reviewing the historical record, Gygax and Arneson had shared a postal correspondence and a number of phone calls in 1973 during the development of D&D, which showed an intent to collaborate, but linking that to concrete contributions that Arneson newly created for D&D was not straightforward. Arneson had playtested the rules, written comments on the draft, and sent along further contributions, but the letter showed Gygax rejecting or rewriting Arneson's submissions specifically because they were not written to be merged into our rules as plagiarized from your rules as drawn from chainmail. The legal requirements to demonstrate collaboration are, however, quite lenient. Nimmer stipulates that the contributions made to a joint work do not need to be compatible in quantity or quality in order for the parties to be co-authors under copyright law, as long as they could prove that Arneson created literally any contribution with an intent to merge it into D&D. The case for joint authorship could be made. For example, case law precedent allowed joint work in cases where only one party contributed the images and another the text for a given book. So Arneson's legal team held up his 4 illustrations of monsters as indisputable examples of copyrightable work created by Arneson intentionally for the D&D project that appeared in the published work unchanged. It is sobering to think that those images only barely made it into the published game, as Arneson sent them at the 11th hour, and the decision to include them in the published booklets was decided arbitrarily. Gygax continued to maintain, as he told the press that summer, that Dave Arneson didn't write a word of the first 3 booklets. Yet ultimately, Arneson's legal team argued that Arneson and Gygax knew exactly how much Arneson had contributed to the work when royalty contracts were drawn up by TSR. The work published with Arneson named as a co-author, and the copyright notice submitted with Arneson designated as a co-author. There was no mutual mistake regarding Arneson's joint authorship, and the entire argument is a sham. But surely nobody had given this matter much thought 6 years earlier, back when no one could have imagined this would be an idea worth more than $300, or the year before when Gygax casually proposed, "I'll whip out a booklet, Gygax and Arneson I trust, and then trust you'd like to split royalties." When Gygax wrote those words, he had no way of knowing how much or little work Arneson would later do toward the development of the game, especially given that Gygax had hoped to publish this through Guidon Games, and Arneson had refused to do further work for Guidon until he had been paid back royalties. Gygax's offer was simply an acknowledgement that he was building on ideas that Arneson had generated, with an expectation that Arneson would help down the road. 1974 and 1975 contracts in no way measured some later percentage of contribution. They simply followed the initial split that Gygax had promised. All this line of argument addressed only TSR's counterattack against Arneson, to make the case that the advanced game was effectively the same game as the original D&D for the purposes of the 1975 contract. They needed a different set of evidence. Arneson's legal team went through the original D&D booklets and cut out the descriptions of various monsters, spells, magic items, and so on, along with parallel passages in the advanced D&D books discussing those elements of the game, and then pasted these clippings side by side on pages that filled binder after binder that they submitted into evidence. So on one side of the page, you would see the text for the owlbear that appears in the AD&D Monster Manual, and on the other, the very similar text from the original D&D, to illustrate how directly the former is derived from the latter. But the case of the owlbear is a curious one, as its original text came from the Greyhawk supplement, authored by Gary Gygax and Rob Kuntz, for which Arneson received no credit or royalty. If Arneson had not demanded royalties for the Greyhawk supplement, which existed at the time the 1975 contract was executed as a component of the game or game rules that made up the original D&D, why did he think he was entitled to claim things like the owlbear as part of the original game now? The answer that Arneson's legal team had another tool at their disposal, the Holmes Basic set, which borrowed liberally from the Greyhawk monsters and spells, and for which Arneson received credit as a co-author and also royalties. So the legal binder submitted into evidence contained numerous clippings from the basic rulebook, including the owlbear. Early drafts of the beginner set had only one Holmes and Gygax's names on them. We can merely speculate how the legal landscape might have changed if TSR had published the basic rules with those credits. The decision in 1977 to instead treat BASIC as simply an edit of the original game, and thus something notionally created jointly with Arneson, was a choice that undermined TSR's later strategy of representing the advanced game as something entirely new and separate. How much more similar to the original game was BASIC than Advance? Both were rewrites and rules changes of the original game, but the first Arneson received royalties for and the second he did not. Arneson's legal team also engaged an expert witness to testify that AD&D was effectively the same game as original D&D, John Freeman, author of The Winner's Guide to Board Games, who is now gaining prominence as a designer of a popular early computer adaptation of D&D called The Temple of Apshai. Gygax could not have been happy to see Freeman appear as an expert witness for Arneson, as Gygax had accredited Freeman personally after reading his article on D&D and Games magazine the year before, gushing in a letter published in the January 1980 issue. John Freeman absolutely knows and understands the game. Freeman's deposition effectively splits into two parts. The first intended to show the conceptual gulf between chainmail and D&D, the second demonstrating the lack of the same between original D&D and advanced D&D. There's nothing of any consequence in D&D that is not included in advanced D&D, Freeman posited. He named many monsters, spells, and magic items which are reused, and singled out the names of the games themselves as a key part of the connection. If AD&D is not D&D, it can't call itself D&D. After all, he said, people are buying the AD&D books because they believe them to be D&D. In his assessment, the differences between the games were trivial. The minutiae of the legal question that decide these matters are almost always unsatisfyingly disconnected from the questions of justice that we want settled. Regardless of what is technically copyrightable and who wrote down the words on the page, Arneson clearly deserves substantial compensation for his contributions to the original game. And as the game's success grew, so did Arneson's take. Gygax pocketed eye-popping royalties for 1980, and Arneson's share of the royalties for the basic set and the original D&D game for that year amounted to $132,241,000. To put in perspective, Arneson received about $750 in 1980 royalties for Adventures in Fantasy from Excalibur. His share of the D&D proceeds was surely a larger amount of money than any game designer in the hobby made at the time other than Gygax himself. It was around a third of Gygax's royalty take. Was that adequate to compensation for his original idea? Arneson could hardly pretend to make little or nothing from his spark or inspiration, like one Brog the Cro-Magnon, but who could say what was fair, especially after so much enmity had built up? The legal instruments involved were not calibrated to determine whether that sum was too much or too little. For TSR, this situation simply needed to be resolved. Arneson's legal team had managed to interpose itself into TSR's ongoing negotiations with 20th Century Fox. A lawyer for the studio asked Arneson's counsel the somewhat leading question, I would also appreciate your informal opinion as to which of the various parties involved has the rights in connection with the Dungeons & Dragons as they pertain to motion pictures. It seemed that the continuing legal situation would cast a pall over any negotiations regarding the film rights. Nor did it stop there. In the document discovery phase of the lawsuit, Arneson's legal team learned of TSR's licensing agreement with Mattel. They demanded copies of any electronic game designs along with draft instruction booklets to ascertain whether any potential original idea of Arneson's might have made its way into that product, which would debut in the coming year. Arnest's team also delved deep into the ongoing work on the basic and expert sets and had begun prying into new work on a new project called Companion Rules, intended, in Gygax's words, to be a pickup of the 3 supplements to the original game Greyhawk, Blackmoor, and Eldritch Wizardry, revised, expanded, edited, and improved. Did Arneson have interest there as well? But beyond all these concerns was the sheer amount of money TSR was making and the amount they projected they would make in the future. If TSR had to settle with Arneson, would they rather negotiate a sum when they were a company making $8 million a year, or $16 million, or $32 million or more? Their potential exposure could only grow if they waited. Something had to be done, and soon. In the final weeks of 1980, Gygax had to come to understand that a confluence of factors, including the business needs of TSR and his own struggles to activate his creativity, made it necessary for him to delegate not just the work on the basic set, but the primary design of D&D. Gygax declared in a December letter to Steve Marsh that he embarked on a quest to identify someone who could co-write, or at worst ghostwrite, new D&D material, but Gygax embraced this path only reluctantly. I would love to give up business for writing, but I cannot in good conscience do so for at least the next couple of years. A suitable understudy for Gygax had to be equal parts energetic and deferential. One TSR employee who fit the bill was Frank Mentzner, who had joined the production department earlier in the year. Currently, he was tasked with ramping up the proposed new membership group for D&D, the Role-Playing Gamers Association. For winning the Masters Tournament at Gen Con that summer, Mentzner was recognized by a Dragon article proclaiming he's the top dungeon master. He was, moreover, protective of Gygax personally, sending him a letter 2 days before Christmas reminding him, "We live in a turbulent time of great tensions. There are a lot of nuts out there, many of whom have a cause," pointing to an event that happened just 2 weeks before. He warned, "Observe the recent death of harmless John Lennon. Also, observe the religious zeal of many uninformed Christians against D&D." This was the downside of how brightly the spotlight shone on Gygax personally. But the imminent threat at the time was not from an assassin. It was looming in a Minnesota district court. So that ends 1980. We'll pick this up again probably tomorrow with 1981 Identity Crisis.